What's going on, golf fans? It's your boy Gsluke. Happy Friday, and here with our round three live stream out there for the ZOZO Championship. Gonna make sure you're ready for all of your DFS and prop exposure this evening to go out there, have yourself a night, and hopefully enjoy some of this Friday night golf. But first off, whether you're watching this on replay already down there in the live chat, hopefully you guys are having a fantastic evening and are ready to get after it for all this golf. As per usual, we'll go through a weather report, a look at the DFS slate, some ownership numbers, a few targets that I'll be using out there in my lineups, and then on the prop side of things, a deep dive of some of the pin locations, the weather, and of course, a few props and underdog and prize picks that I've already entered myself. But I wanted to make sure to give you guys all the goods out there for round three, so hopefully you guys are having a fantastic night. Before we go ahead and fully deep dive the slate, I do want to remind you guys of the presenting sponsor of this live stream, which are our friends over there at the Ship It Nation, a great source for all your needs on DFS. So if you're somebody that's an NBA DFS player, who's been starting to get into that side of things as the season starts up, make sure to check out the Ship It Nation. Code Luke10 will give you a discount off any membership. Let's go ahead and hop on into this slate. So in terms of the golf course, it played pretty easy, just like round number one. That was to be expected with a calm weather forecast, and it played a lot easier in the morning than the afternoon. Now, just like round number one, I think it'd be pretty hard to find a massive difference other than the rainstorm that they got around 1 p.m. So some of the later starters had to play through some rain for about an hour out there. But outside of that, that was the only difference between the morning and the afternoon. So maybe it was variance, maybe it had to do with that rainstorm, but whether it was the morning or the afternoon, you had ceiling performances from both waves and also solid scoring all around as well. So we'll look at this when we get to the prop side of things, but anytime we have threesomes off of both tees, it's that same kind of situation out there for round three. There's not going to be a massive weather edge to go after. So in my opinion, especially when you look at this forecast, which is pretty flat, I don't see a huge edge to go after. Now, could there be a rainstorm that comes through and jumps up things again? Absolutely. This is the thunderstorm time of the year over there in Japan, so they get quite a few of those pop-up storms, but that's going to be extremely hard to predict. So I would say with your lineups, anytime you have this kind of tee time situation, you're probably getting a little bit too cute if you're going out there and stacking one side or the other. But if you're a 150 maxer, maybe you could take 10% of your lineups and stack the first 3-4 groups in either direction. So either the first 3 or 4 groups off, or maybe the last 3 or 4 groups. You could take a few lineups and stack them, but you'd just be hoping to get the weather situation right. So rounds 1 and 2, I think any sort of differences that we saw were mostly due to noise. And if you're doing that out there in round 3, I think you're doing a little bit too much. So more so what we're going to look at are some of the ball striking poppers, try and make sure we have players that aren't just putting way above their baseline in our lineups. And then the most important aspect of round 3 showdown is going to be that game theory and ownership component, because when we get to round 3, we still don't have place and points in play like what we're going to have out there for Sunday, and the ownership is congregated around the top end of the board. So this is the leaderboard as of right now. And Echeverria, a lot higher owned than he probably should be. And really anyone that's starting in the top 13, even top 16 down here, the whole way down to T22, these are going to be your highest owned players out there for round 3 showdown. So it's not that you can't play anyone that's towards the top end of the board. They are in fact the best form players. So there's reasoning for wanting to get to a few of those kind of options. The unfortunate part is, and the reason why you should be fading a vast majority of these players is because they're 3, sometimes even 4 or 5 times higher owned than some of the other players priced around them. So, sparingly pick your chalk towards the top end of the board, and you're going to see that reflected in my player pool. It's going to be a lot of pivots out there for round 3. We don't really have a massive weather edge to go after. So a majority of our edge out there for round 3 showdown is going to be generated out there from game theory. So that's usually the case for round 3 showdown, but wanted to cover that for anyone that's maybe a little bit new to the format. Let me bring up our projections. We'll go through some of what we expect out there for today. Now's a great time for questions if you guys have anything on specific players. But as per usual, I'm just going to go through some of the guys that I'm using. Not so much to give you guys a player pool out there yourself, but this is much more to give you, and I insight into what I'm using in my process, what I'm looking for in players myself. Even if I was going to give you guys players to use in your lineups, I'd only be able to give you so many here in a live stream. My Patreon page has my entire player pool. So if you just want to see that black and white, that's the place to go out there and check that out. But what we're going to go through here is more so why I'm getting to specific players. And obviously I tried to pick out, specific examples that hammer home a certain point or two. So that's what I want you guys to pay attention to here. If you happen to agree with one of the plays and want to use them yourself, then obviously feel free to do so, right? You have your own lineups. You're in control of your own destiny out there. I'm not going to tell you not to play who I am, but again, only do it if you actually agree with what I'm saying. So up top, I'm going to have a lot of Sun GM there in the 10K plus range. Sun GM's a lot lower owned than those top two players. So Xander Schauffele, I've got it over 25%. You can see over there on my Patreon projections. And by the way, in my Patreon page, you can join that in the description of this live stream or replay. There's a link to go out there and join that. But I've got him at over 25% and Colin Morikawa a little bit over 30% owned. So the reason why I like Sunjay is he's about half the ownership of a Colin Morikawa, and we don't get placement points out there for round 3. It's completely irrelevant where these players are starting. And heading into the week, Sunjay may have been a slight step down in terms of talent level compared to some of those other top level players, but he doesn't have half the chance to go out there and be optimal today, right? He's not got like a 5% chance of being optimal as opposed to like 10 to 15% on some of these other players. It's like the difference of like a 5-6% optimal rate compared to like a 4 or 5% down there with Sunjay M. So you're talking about very small differences in terms of how optimal Sunjay M is going to be. And he's about half the ownership of some of those other players up top. So when you look at it like that, when you just look at it in terms of what are his chances of actually getting to the optimal lineup, he is underutilized towards the top end of the board here. So he's $10,000. He's had a very pedestrian start to the week. That's reflected there with the even par score, but you're getting low ownership. We know the kind of form that he had coming in, which was gaining strokes to the field in 8 straight events, with 6 of those 8 starts being top 12 finishes. So what I more so care about out here for round 3 showdown is a player's long-term baseline, or their baseline over their last 6 to 8 events, and less so what they've done over the first 36 holes. There are going to be countless examples of guys, perhaps like Sunjay, hopefully. If things go our way, it'll end up turning out like this. But perhaps players like Sunjay that spin their wheels days 1 and 2 and that really get it working over the weekend. Some of these guys maybe even missed the cut if they had a 36-hole cut line. Sunjay would have been pretty close to getting cut after 36 holes. So here at $10,000, he's getting a little bit of a second life over the weekend. Don't be surprised if you see a few of these players bounce back and end up towards the top 25 to top 15 at this kind of golf tournament. Next up, we've got ourselves Minwoo Lee, who is a little bit more popular than what we have there with Sunjay. He's a lot less popular, though, than somebody like JT, who I've got well over 30% owned, and even a Kurt Kitayama, who I have in that same kind of ownership range. Beau Hossler, also about 18% owned there at $9,100. I'd rather have Minwoo Lee, who is the best player down here towards the bottom end of the 9K range. And if anything, he's about average ownership. And -2 might not be a sexy score after 2 rounds. Might not be starting in the top 5, top 10 like some of the other players in this range are. But he's still playing solid. I mean, he went out there. He's -2 over the first few days. And if anything, I think has a lot of upside to come, as he hasn't played a lot of golf during the fall. He didn't play much on the DP World Tour, hardly played at all over here on the fall swing on the PGA Tour. So you'd expect guys like Minwoo. I mean, you saw it with Xander round 1, right? Really struggled out there on Thursday and then kicked it in the gear out there on Friday. And it's not even like Minwoo has played horribly to this point. -2, very respectable over the first few days. But I think that he's got a lot of upside going forward as he shakes off that rust and starts to get back to that birdie or better upside that we know him for. So you give me average ownership on a player that I think is well above average here in the 9K range, then I'm going to be over the field on that kind of player. In terms of the high-owned options, that would be a JT, who I already pointed out is over 30%. And Max Grazerman and Eric Cole are all relatively chalky. But what I'll tell you about those 3 chalky players there is that I'm playing one of those out there in my lineup. So just because they're towards the top end of the board does not mean that they're an automatic cross-off. I'm fading well over half the chalky players on the slate, but there are a few that I have a soft spot for. So I'm just going to go ahead and give you which one of those players that is, and that would be an Eric Cole for me. He had the second place finish here last year. He's also been really hitting the ball well over the first few days. He's top 10 in shots gained ball striking. So if there's going to be a chalky piece that I'm using, it's a course history and a guy that's really hitting the ball well. So, I'm being very picky, very stingy about that chalk that I'm using. And I guess Eric Cole would be an example of somebody that I would do that with. I've also got Max Homa here at $8,300. He's 10.8% projected owned. So he's I would say about average, maybe slightly below average ownership here towards the bottom end of the 8K range. I mean, Harry Hall, Seamus Power are significantly higher owned. Eric Cole, as you would expect, significantly higher owned than a Max Homa. And long term, you're getting a much better player than the $8,300 price tag would indicate. And he's not playing that terribly this week. -1, it's not a sexy score over the first few days, but that is just slightly worse than the field average. And considering that this is a poor course fit for Max Homa, shows us that the approach play, the putting has been a little bit better than it has been recently, because with his off the tee play towards the end of this season, I mean, that would have been a death sentence around Narashino Country Club, historically at least. This golf course really punishes you off the tee. And the fact that he's not like +4, +5 right now is, I think, a massive piece of optimism out there for Homa, because that means that his off the tee play isn't that far off. So -1, about average ownership towards the bottom end of this range, maybe even a little bit of leverage there at 10.8% is the kind of player that I like to mix in, as opposed to like a super chalky option like a Seamus Power, who I would be fading, or even a Taylor Moore. Great form, love to see Taylor Moore playing well. He's a pretty good kid, but at the same time, I'm not going to play him at 20% ownership when we have Max Homa, who's long-term, we know, a better player and about half the owned. You go out there, you play him in 20, 25%, and you've got your leverage right there. What's going on, Jordan? Hopefully you're having a fantastic Friday. If you have any questions, just go ahead, let me know. Moving down to the 7K range, we got Ricky Fowler at $7,700. He's another more popular option that I'm getting to. As I've already mentioned, you can take a few pieces of chalk out there in your player pool. You don't have to feel like you're completely allergic to it. So -8, solid form out there for Ricky Fowler. He's also played decently at this event over the last 4 starts. Hasn't been anything earth-shattering, but if we take a look at the event history for Ricky real quick, who was, there he is, second place there 2 years ago. No cut at this event. So T64, T44 really doesn't mean all that much, but he did have the T2 finish there a few years ago, and that was a slump buster for him. He had really been playing poor golf heading into that ZOZO Championship. I think the week before, the CJ Cup was the first time in a long time that he had gone into contention, and then he parlayed that into a top 5 finish the week after. So I think it's safe to say that he's got some good vibes around this golf course, especially because he hasn't had a lot of those top 5 finishes over the last 5 or so years. And the off the tee play last week looked great. Last time out, Ricky Fowler really surprised me off the tee. That has continued into this event, and the approach play has also improved. So the new putter, you've probably seen in the media this fall that he's completely switched putters from that jailbreak that he was using before. The putter has not caught on. He has been atrocious on the greens, even after making the putter change. But the ball striking is back to vintage Ricky Fowler. And I know it's a weak field event, so we can't get too excited about what we're seeing. But it is a very positive sign for his game going forward. And if he can find a putter, he's doing it tee to green, especially with his ball striking, setting up plenty of opportunities to go out there and score. Speaking of scoring, Ryan Fox is an absolute scoring machine with his length off the tee. He has been in a little bit of a slump lately. He was dealing with an injury about a month back. DP World Tour announcers were all over that. I heard nothing of it on the PGA Tour broadcast. And on the DP World Tour, the broadcasters were smart enough to let us know that he's been dealing with an injury for like 2-3 months. So that's why maybe he hasn't been hitting it and, performing at his elite level that he's used to over there on the DP World Tour. But in this kind of field, he shouldn't be $7,500. And when he gets over this injury that he's dealing with, he's better than Minwoo. I mean, he's on that same kind of level. He's for sure better than guys like a Hostler, Doug Gim, Grazerman, Eric Cole, really this entire 8K range. He's a clearly better player than all of those kind of players. So down here at +2, he's a risky option because he is still technically dealing with the injury, but he's had a few pop rounds. Specifically last week, round 3, he went out there, shot -6 on a pretty hard day of conditions out there at that tournament. He's only 2.6% owned, and he's a lot cheaper than he should be. So this is the kind of player that you can use to offset some chalk. Like, for example, maybe you used Ricky Fowler in a lineup alongside Minwoo towards the top. He's nearly 20%. Now, those two players aren't terrible chalk, right? They're not 30, 35%. Like, I've gone on a few players out here for round 3, but even if you used a 30, 33%er out there in your lineups, you throw in a 2.6% owned play like Ryan Fox, that is going to do a lot to offset that chalk. So there's a time and place for getting to a risky play like a Ryan Fox, but even though he's quote unquote risky, last week he showed us a lot of that upside. Mark Hubbard down here at $7,200. He is sub 10% owned out there in Showdown contests. What I like about Mark Hubbard's the birdie or better upside. He's a top 30 birdie maker on the PGA Tour this year. In this field, that puts him in the top 7 for birdie or better percentage. So up there with some of the elite tier players, just behind a Chan Kim when it comes to birdie or better percentage. Harry Hall also alongside him up there in those rankings. And he's only $7,200. He hasn't played his best. He's even par over the first 2 rounds, which isn't anything sexy, but it's also not terrible. It's 2 shots gained lost to the field over the first few rounds. He tends to be a volatile player, a little bit streaky, can, shake it off some rust, get after it rather quickly. We've seen him be first round leader a lot of times out there on the PGA Tour before. I like that wide range of outcomes. I like these more risky plays out there for GPPs, as they'll give you some leverage off the more chalky players around them. So for example, Harada, I've got over 10%. I've got Takumi Kanaya at nearly 10% ownership. I've got Andrew Novak at over 10% ownership. You can get Mark Hubbard at half the ownership, and long-term, he's by far the best birdie maker out of all of those players, and probably just the best player, period, out of all of those players as well. So round 3 Showdown is the ultimate time to go out there and make some game theory pivots, as you're going to see a ton of overreactions to the first 3 days, or first 2 days in this case. And lastly, we've got Ben Coles as the last play that I want to point out to you guys. Again, this isn't to give you a player poll, more so to give you insight into what I'm looking for. And Ben Coles has been absolutely striping it so far this week. So if I go over to Data Golf real quick, give you guys the exact numbers. He's gaining just under a stroke off the tee per round, and then he's gaining nearly 1.25 shots gained approach per round. So that is 2 shots gained ball striking per round. That is, let me see what that puts him at for the field. I know it's top 15, but let me give you an exact number in terms of shots gained ball striking. Let me add it to the table. So yeah, Ben Coles is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8th in the field when it comes to his shots gained ball striking. And when you compare to the rest of the top 7 in shots gained ball striking, the worst player is like Nick Taylor at -5, Sam Stevens at -6. Like, you've got Echeverria -12. You've got JT -10, CT Pan -9, leading the way in shots gained ball striking. Those sort of players have had a lot more out of their score than anyone else. And Ben Coles, the reason why he's not -5 or -10, like some of the other guys on that top 7 of shots gained ball striking, is that he's losing in both the short game categories, losing about a shot around the green per round, which is not what he's used to. He's a pretty decent around the green player. I wouldn't call him elite in that category, but he is an elite tier putter. And for some reason, he's been on a real cold spell lately out there with the flat stick. He's losing 1.5 shots gained putting per round right now. So he's going to need that to turn around. But long term, Ben Coles is the kind of player that you'd expect to turn around the putting sooner rather than later, an elite tier putter, and the kind of guy that if he's hitting it as well as he is, I think that it gives him a lot of upside to go out there and have a spike round, because that's normally what we're waiting to come around, to go out there and give him a chance to have a spike round. And now that's what he's been doing rather consistently lately. So I'll take him, hope we get that putting regression. And if it does, if that comes, we're going to get a solid -4, maybe even -5 round at $6,700, which would be massive out there in GBP. So he's only 2.8% owned. Another player just like Ryan Fox, that if you're using some chalk towards the top end of the board, can really offset some of that ownership that you're taking. So a good time and place for playing somebody like Ben Coles, maybe a little bit risky because we do need that putter to come along. But in certain contests, certain types of DFS contests, like specifically large field GPPs, I think could bring a lot of upside to this kind of slate. So let me see if there's any specific questions. If not, we're going to go through some lineup construction and then a few props. So we do have a question about who makes more birdies between Fox or Fishburne. So I would look at the stats. If I'm talking long term, I would lean Ryan Fox over Fishburne. But what I want to check on is who's ball striking it better right now. So you've got Ryan Fox, who's about neutral with his shots gained ball striking, and then let me check on Fishburne. And Fishburne is slightly into the positive, gaining about a half a stroke per round ball striking. So the long-term stuff, as I mentioned, Ryan Fox would be the favorite. This week, though, Patrick Fishburne is playing a little bit better than what we have with Ryan Fox. So I would say that that one's a toss-up. The long-term stuff favors one guy. The short-term stuff slightly favors the other player. So I think that's a pretty good line. If I had to break the tie, I always go with long-term form because short-term form is volatile. It's susceptible to a lot of variance, a lot of noise. So I'd go with Ryan Fox. How are ownership projections known or calculated? So they're calculated based on, first off, an algorithm, then they're hand-tuned by me based on experience in playing in GPPs, and they're not known ahead of time, right? It's not like we have Draftkings giving us the data on ownership. That's why it's projected GPP ownership, right? It's not why it says what the GPP ownership 100% is going to be. So there's obviously a lot of variance in these. Some of them are going to be spot on. Some of them might be off by 3-4%. But when you've played DFS long enough, when you've been creating ownership projections like I have for over 4 years, you know what to put in your algorithm when you go out there and calculate it. So a lot of it is based on projected fantasy points. I can't give you too much because it's proprietary. I got to keep a lot of it behind the paywall. A lot of my projections are based on their points per dollar value. The reason for that is, especially large field GPPs, which is what the projections are made for, people are making lineups with optimizers, right? A 150 max contest, not many people are building 150 lineups by hand. And when you're using an optimizer, it is going to spit out the highest, most efficient players that you can use. Hence, the players with the highest points per dollar value. Optimizer optimizes points per dollar value. Again, I can't talk about this too much, but the projections are highly correlated to points per dollar value, right? Because if the optimizer is going to spit out that player more, well, we know that they're going to be higher owned out there by the industry. So again, can't give away too much about that, but hopefully it gives you an idea, right? The players that are going to be used more because they have the best projections compared to price are the ones that are going to be higher owned. And as I said, there's a little bit of hand tinkering that goes on top of that, but that comes down to experience, having done that for nearly 5 years at this point. Of course, Jordan, best of luck out there with everything that you're doing. So let me bring up DraftKings. Let's talk through some lineup construction. So, we can talk all we'd like about players making a player pool. The other aspect of going out there and playing DFS is putting them together in lineups. And I would argue the more important aspect of going out there and playing DFS is going out here and implementing your lineup construction, because you may have heard this from my friend Tambo. I've heard it from a few other content creators as well. It's been a long-term standing thing, a long-term, what's the word? I can't think of the word. It's a phrase that we've heard for a long time. I'm sure there's a better phrasing for that. But essentially what that means is not who you use out there in lineups, right? Like you can build the perfect player pool. It's how you use them out there in your lineups. And I think the perfect way to encapsulate that is out there in a large field GPP, because in cash, it's not that interesting. In cash, your strategy, your entire goal is to go out there and optimize projection. So, ownership, all of that kind of stuff that we're going to talk about right now, not as important over there in cash. The more important lineup construction talk is always when it comes to GPPs, because in large field GPPs, you're trying to find the fine line between optimizing projection, which is still important, just like you have out there in cash. It's the only thing that you're looking for out there in cash. But then you're also trying to play that game theory component, which we've already talked about a bunch here in the live stream. But going out there, trying to make sure that you're different enough out there in those contests that when you get some of the better plays, you get 3 or 4 of the optimal plays in a lineup, that you're actually moving up the leaderboards. Because if you're playing somebody and they're optimal, that's great, right? That's the goal when you're going out there and playing in a DFS lineup. But if they're going to be 35% owned, like we have on a few players this evening, then you're getting less out of it than if that player was 2 to 5% owned. Reasoning for that, of course, is if you're playing a 35% owned player and they go off, they have an optimal performance, 35% of the field has that same player. And in a large field GPP where you might be playing against, I guess on these kind of showdown slates, it's like 2 to 10,000 entries at the very most, because we don't have the best showdown contests out there for this kind of week. But even in a 2 to 10,000 entry contest, if it's 35% of the field, that might be nearly 4,000 entries that you're going out there and playing against that just have that one specific player. And obviously, that's just one example, right? That's one of the 6 slots that you're choosing from. But that same idea can be taken from one slot in a lineup and used among the other 6, right? If you're using chalk at one spot, maybe that's 4,000 lineups that have that one specific player. You throw in another guy that's 30% owned, well, that's probably at least 1,000 lineups, maybe even more than that. They're going to have those 2 specific players together, and so on and so forth till the end, where you might end up with a lineup that is duplicated 5 to 10 times out there in the GPP. That is the number one thing you want to avoid out there in those large field GPPs, and why you hear touts like myself, regardless of sport, it could be golf DFS, it could be NFL DFS, NBA DFS, just talk about leverage nonstop, because it's how you generate an edge out there in every sport. In golf, even more so, because this is a sport with a ton of variance. This is a sport where even your best players, like for example, Xander Schauffele, goes out there and shoots 4 over par round number 1, right? -5 round 2. We took advantage of that out there in our lineups. Of course, he was our number 1 play out there from yesterday's live stream. But it's a crazy ass sport. And if you think that you're going to go out there and just play all the chalk and get away with it with golf, let alone other sports which are variant enough out there. NBA is probably the least variant, but even that, you're going to see some crazy shit happen in NBA, then you're going to get ran over out here in these GPPs. So I know we haven't even started clicking any players, but I want to make sure we're on the same page, right? Our goal is partially to go out there and optimize projection, but that game theory component is honestly even more important in my opinion. A truism, do I think this tournament has played out with less importance than driving accuracy than projected? I haven't ran any numbers. You're saying 4 of the 8 players are hitting less than 60% of fairways. Let's wait until after round 4. And the one thing I'll say about the shot tracker, Greg, is that it doesn't look all that reliable. So I don't know if I'm using those shots gained metrics as much this week. And yeah, like I said, it's only been 2 rounds so far. So I know, for example, that Xander Schauffele missed a fairway and made a quad bogey, right? Yesterday, Thigala hit a ball out of bounds off the tee and then had his one bad hole of the entire round. Off the tee accuracy definitely matters. You can probably find counter examples, right? 4 of the top 8, for example. But what about the other 4, right? The other 4, I'm sure, are hitting a bunch of fairways over 60%. So let's see what happens after 4 rounds, and specifically what happens in crunch time, because those misses, those double, triple bogeys, they tend to happen in crunch time, right? Not necessarily on a Thursday or Friday per se. All right, let's talk through. So let's build a lineup, and then we're going to go through some prop stuff. So in terms of our lineup construction out here for round 3, we're trying to, again, optimize projection and get different. So I still like guys like Sanjay because he gives us the best of both worlds. He's still one of the best players in the field. I know he hasn't had the hottest start to the week, but long-term, he projects just as well as guys like Hideki or Colin Morikawa, maybe like a point and a half less out there in terms of projection, but he's going to be like half the ownership. So in this kind of scenario, we're getting a player that's lower owned, which checks the game theory box, and a player that's solidly projecting. So let's throw him in there. Minwoo Lee is another example where we're getting the best of both worlds. About average ownership, my favorite play down there in the 9K range. Here in this 8K range, we're looking for a lot of the same. So a Max Homa, because he is so cheap, would make a lot of sense at $8,300. Also not mega chalky because of his pedestrian start to the week. Let's throw a Ricky Fowler in here. So we're going to throw some ownership in with Fowler, but we've got 3 pivots. I'm not really worried about the ownership in this kind of lineup, especially when we can throw in a Ryan Fox at sub 3% ownership. And then for our last man in here, I mean, even if we wanted to make it chalky, we could, and we could totally get away with it because of the pivots that we've already taken. But just for the sake of really going after game theory, like, my preferred option to round off that kind of lineup would probably be Mark Hubbard there at $7,200. Reason for that is that he's just the best projection I have down there in that range. As previously talked about, he's got the best birdie or better percentage of the guys down there in the bottom end of the 7K range. And he's also a game theory pivot. He's about 6.5% owned, if memory serves me correctly. So this kind of lineup is what I'm looking at out there in GPPs. It may not be this specific combination of players, of course, but more so what I want to point out here is that there's one guy that you might say is a little chalky there with a Ricky Fowler. Even if we wanted to push this to 2, like, I like Eric Cole. I already told you guys I'm playing a pretty chalky Eric Cole. If you had this combination of 5 players here, And then, yeah, Eric Cole, Ricky Fowler, your 2 pieces of chalk. Because you have Sanjay, who's a little bit lower owned, you've got Ryan Fox at sub 5%. As long as your last man in here isn't chalky, so let's say probably not Harada, right? Harada's over 10%. You'd want to avoid him. But if you took Hoffman, Brendan Todd for sure. He's sub 1% owned. I don't think many people are going to use a plus 11 Brendan Todd, if we're being honest. Justin Lauer here at plus 2. Like, you could use him out there for leverage. You use anyone but an over 10% owned Harada, you're going to be totally fine, even with 2 pieces of chalk out there in your lineup. So, and that's about as much chalk as I'll get to. Those are really the 2 highest owned players that I'm even using out there in lineups. So I'm not going to have to worry about the game theory as much with a very differentiated player pool. But even if you had more chalk, this shows you that you can get away with it as long as you're careful with your ownership towards the middle to top end of the board. So that's what I'll say about your round 3 lineups, is try and lean into the game theory where you can. But what you'll notice about that lineup is that it wasn't 6 pivots. It wasn't 6 players that are playing dog shit golf to this point. In most cases, it's guys that have been kind of shaky, but just, not terrible over the first 2 days that you're hoping can get it into gear a little bit. You're not completely sacrificing projection out there for round 3. And at the same time, we're not completely taking all of the chalk either. So just make sure that you're going through trying to find that fine balance between projection and your ownership. Because if you go too far in one direction is where you start to get into trouble. For example, if you get too chalky in a lineup is where you start to have to worry about duplicating. You start worrying about game theory a little bit too much. And then you start entering lineups that are just projecting way too low to actually go out there and get there. Just try and find a fine balance, as I've already mentioned. So that lineup should give you a good example of what that would look like. And if you have any specific questions, just let me know down there in the live chat. But now we're going to circle into the prop side of things. So if you're just here for DFS, I appreciate you guys stopping by as usual. Go ahead, smash that like button if you guys haven't already. We're going to be doing a round 4 live stream as well. So make sure to stop on by for that. It'll be at a similar time out there tomorrow afternoon. And for the rest of the season out there as well. So a few more fall series events. I'll be at the RSM Classic, so we're going to have some boots on the ground there, and of course for the regular season there in 2025. So I appreciate you guys stopping by as usual. Still have a lot of prop stuff to go through here. So if you're playing on Underdog and Prize Picks, don't go anywhere. We're still going to talk about plenty on that side, but I know we've got plenty of DFS only people that watch the channel, so just want to send those people on their way. Great call on the Xander bounce back. Yeah, thank you for that, man. It was nice out there in lineups. It carried a lot of mine to min caches. Wasn't my best day on Showdown, admittedly. I think I had like a 1.2x ROI. But the reason why it was slightly into the positive was mostly because of Xander. So I appreciate that, man. Thank you for that. And yeah, hopefully it helped you out as well. It got me slightly into the positive, so we'll take the small wins where we can get them. But let's talk through these stat averages before we talk through a few props that I've already taken, which, speaking of, I'm going to bring up Prize Picks, as that's where I entered a prop slip so far, so that we can just seamlessly transition to that after going through these averages. So there we go. Got it up. Let me share this, and let's go through the stat averages before we go through the slip. So scoring average was about 1 under par, a little bit better than 1 under par. And the par 70 setup, that puts it at a 68.88 scoring average. Birdie average was just a tick under 4 per round and just a little bit over 2.5 bogeys per round. And the Euro Golf stuff would be great to look at, but Prize Picks Underdog don't even have anything posted. I think partially because round 2 hasn't quite ended yet. They had some kind of delay towards the end of play, and they couldn't get everything in. So we're just going to focus on the PGA side up here. And if you're just joining us, we'll circle back to the weather as well. I'm actually going to go ahead and refresh this to make sure that we have the latest look at the forecast. My favorite for over here in Japan has been the GFS. It seems to be the most accurate over there on that side of the pond. And you've got sub 7 miles an hour of wind all of Saturday and temperatures that are between 65 to 71 degrees. It's very consistent. It's pretty much the same conditions that we've had for the first few days. So these scoring averages, I think, will be pretty accurate out there for round number 3, especially considering that there wasn't a cut line. The only player that won't be teeing it up out there at round 3 will be Mav McNeely, who ended up withdrawing, who he screwed a few of my lineups yesterday, actually, which was mildly annoying, especially the withdraw after lock. But because it's pretty much the same guys that were playing rounds 1 and 2 that are going out there and playing today, and the same weather as what we had for days 1 and 2. The scoring averages from yesterday and what we had out there for round 1 are going to be very useful out there for Saturday. So just speaking of that, let's go over here to Prize Picks and show you what I took. So I took an over on Andrew Novak pars or better, and then I ended up fading CT Pan strokes. So let's talk about the Andrew Novak prop first and then talk about CT Pan. So this over on Andrew Novak pars or better, the reasoning for that is that he's the number 15 player on the PGA Tour when it comes to bogey avoidance. I'm not talking in this field. And all the PGA Tour, he is the 15th ranked player when it comes to that category. So at 2.5 pars or better, he's essentially at the bogey average for the field. Of course, a 15.5 pars or better line is the same thing as a 2.5 bogeys or worse line out there on books. And if he's going to be a top 15 player on the PGA Tour, that is top 3 of all the players in this field. And he's clearly projecting for less bogeys than this field average. So if it's going to be like 2.57, conditions look pretty calm out there for tomorrow. If you take a look at the shots gained metrics out there for Andrew Novak, what you'll see is that he's gaining in every category but the putter. That is very sustainable stuff. And he's gone under this line the first 2 days. No bogeys round 2. I should say over pars or better, under bogeys or worse line the first few days. And then round number 1, he only had 1 bogey over there on hole number 15. So I really like that over on Andrew Novak pars or better. And he doesn't have a line for comparison, but I was looking over here on Caesars William Hill. He's an even better bogey avoider than somebody like in Seamus Power, who Seamus is having a pretty good week. He's minus 155 for his under at 2.5 bogeys. Andrew Novak is long-term a better bogey avoider than what you have there with Seamus Power. So though he doesn't have an actual line for comparison, if somebody like him is going to be minus 155 and Eric Cole is going to be minus 140, you'd have to think an elite tier player in the category might even carry more juice than that. So I would say that this, even though we don't have like the for sure plus EV value, is probably even better value than some of those other props on the board. And then this over on CT Pan was partially because it was plus EV. He's playing really good golf. So I'm going to have to show you the shots gained metrics because it definitely makes me a little bit nervous. But over here on FanDuel, you'll see that he's minus 140 for his over. And if you go over here to DraftKings and scroll down to CT Pan, you'll see that he's minus 135 for his over there on DraftKings, which is pretty much right in that plus EV range that we're looking for. The issue with the CT Pan over, I still played it. I still stand behind it. I'm using it. I think it was $250 out there on the slip myself. Here's the issue with CT Pan. He's the number 1 player in the field in shots gained ball striking. That is mildly terrifying. The one thing we'll say, though, about the shots gained metrics this week is that the shot tracker has been extremely wrong. I mean, there's been some shots on there that there's just no way in hell that it could have actually happened. So maybe he's number 1 because he's had a lot of shot tracker mistakes going his way. Reality is he's probably playing pretty well this week, particularly on approach where it says he's gaining over 2 strokes per round. But CT Pan isn't necessarily used to doing that. He's like at best about an average player in this kind of field. And the scoring average round 1 was only -1. Scoring average round 2 was just a little bit better than -1. To get to 68, which is what he'd need to go under this kind of line, that's why I'm taking the over, he'd have to get to -2, right? He'd have to like gain an entire stroke to the field. And if we go over here and I click on CT Pan and we take a look at some of the results, you'll see that he's like average at best, right? He's lost in 3 of his last 4 events. When he's gaining, it's like a stroke per round at the very best. So we're asking him to match like what he's doing at the very best lately to go out there and cover this kind of line. So I just think it's asking quite a bit. The sportsbook odds obviously reflect that with the -140, -135 juice in our favor. So that's what I took out there for the 2-man slip. So it's pays 3x because one of them's a positive stance play. One of them is going to be a fade. Over here in Underdog, they don't have the bogey or worse lines up, or at least they didn't have them up before. So let me see if they added Andrew Novak. So yeah, they still don't have his bogey or worse line post over there. So I guess if you're going to enter anything, do it on Prize Picks. They're the ones that have been posting the boards first, and the Underdog has just been completely ripping them off. So, if they're going to have more selection out here with these pars or better and the birdie or better props, which the matchups, I should say, which aren't my favorite, but if it's your cup of tea, I guess you can go out there and play a few. They've got more options and they're not copying the other website. So if you play on both, if you only play Underdog, then I guess you got to play over there, right? You don't have that many choices. You play on both, though. My recommendation is to play here on Prize Picks. So I'm not sponsored, not going to give you guys any sort of code to go out there either. That is just my pure opinion on this. no sort of financial swaying on that whatsoever. And let's see if there's any questions. If not, I'm gonna rock on out of here. All right, looks like we're good. Alrighty, guys, best of luck out there for all of your exposure today. But it's over there with your Draftkings lineups or over there on the prop side. Make sure to check out the Patreon page for all of the behind-the-scenes content that you guys saw there. That would include the spreadsheet with all my projections and player pool completely unblacked out. So uncensored over there for all my Patreon members. You can find a link for my Patreon page down there in the description of this video / replay. You can also get all the prop slips that I'm entering as well. So over there on PrizePicks Underdog, I'm going to have a lot more exposure than just those two props that we've gone with. And if you want to see every single slip that I'm getting to, the projections, the thought process behind getting to them, go out there and check that out as well. Not only does it give you my exposure, but I'm all about teaching the process. That's why I go through my projections. That's why I go through the reasoning for getting to certain props, whether it's correlation, whether it's weather-based, whether it's just good line value compared to what we have on sports books. And make sure to point that out to you guys, not just so that you know why we're playing things, but also to show you guys what to look for yourself out there in props. Because the whole idea with my Patreon page is not just to, hand you guys out info, hand you guys out player pools. Like, I guess if you really want to do that, you could out there with my player pools and etc. The main idea, though, is to teach you how to fish, right? So you can go out there and continue the process yourself. And then hopefully someday you don't have to have a subscription to one of these websites like my own, right? You can go out there and do a lot of it your own. Prop side or DFS, that's the goal. So that's why I talk so much. That's why I go through so much over there on my props to try and give you guys a little taste for that. And hopefully make your process better going forward. So that's all I've got, guys. Best of luck out there with everything that you're getting to. And hopefully you can make your boy proud out there with your exposure.